Order, order. Welcome to this oral evidence session of the Education Select Committee this morning. This morning we are hearing from witnesses as one of two evidence sessions in public on the issue of historical forced adoptions. I wanted at the start of the session just to acknowledge the sensitivity of the material that we are discussing today and the terrible and deep and long-lasting impacts that the period of our history that involved forced adoptions has had, both on mothers whose children were removed and on adult adoptees who also suffered the experience of being forcibly removed, and on others who were caught up in a system that we all know to be brutal in its nature. And so I wanted to acknowledge that sensitivity this morning and the impact that some of the evidence that we may hear today might have, particularly on those who have lived experience. In our second evidence session, we will be hearing directly from those with lived experience. But today we are taking evidence around the topic to support and inform that second evidence session. So can I invite our witnesses today to introduce yourselves to us and to make any opening remarks before we get going with our questioning, starting with Professor Harold Gordon.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I'm Professor Gordon Harold, University of Cambridge, and I welcome opportunity again to speak to this committee on this important and timely topic.
My name is Dr. Michael Lambert. I'm a lecturer in medical humanities at Lancaster University. My background is in archival research, so looking at deposited records of the government, local authorities, voluntary organisations, with a view to understanding social policy decision making.
Good morning, I'm Dr. Janet Greenlees. I'm a reader in health history based at Glasgow Caledonian University, and I have done research on mother and baby homes in Scotland, and my background is archival research, but also oral histories.
Good morning, my name is James Gallen. I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University, and my research looks at justice responses to non-recent institutional abuses.
Thank you very much. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I'm going to begin our questioning, first of all, with a question to Professor Harold and to Dr. Lambert. Between 1949 and 1976, what choices did an unmarried woman have on discovering that she was pregnant?
The language of legal choice, which is a separate matter, and the language of practical, accessible choice. And it would be fair to say that mothers had no choice. A young woman who might seek advice or guidance from any recognised source today, teacher, parent, medical professional, member of the church, community member, to ask guidance in a circumstance that might be distressing or difficult. These were not accessible options for young women, for mothers. Women were entirely isolated, left with unknowns both in terms of their circumstance, fear, stigma, shame, perception of bringing family shame, community shame, and were in the hands of those who guided them around their options, and the options provided to them were not in accord with legal options at the time.
Thank you, Dr. Lambert.
I think I'd like to complement Gordon's answer in two ways. I think understanding the lack of support that the state was providing for families outside of marriage, that what we understand today in terms of housing, social security and childcare, they simply didn't exist. There was a concerted reluctance on the part of the state to provide the role that they thought to be the male breadwinner within a family. They didn't want a substitute role, and policies were actively designed to prevent that situation from occurring, to reduce the financial cost, but also to set a precedent. You've then got the other side of that coin, where there was significant investment by the government across a number of levels in mother and baby homes and adoption as a policy solution to the problem of sex outside of marriage and children. So you have those two things coexisting at the same time. It was a series of conscious decisions. This was a broader system that had no single point of control, but was clearly producing this overall logic of a lack of choice being the end result for women who found themselves pregnant at that time.
Thank you. And you've spoken about the difference between a practical choice and the choices that might have been there on paper but were not really there in reality. Can you say a little bit more about how kind of social, moral, religious expectations influence the kind of reality of that choice?
If I may, so if we can think of let's say a 15 to 18-year-old young woman developmentally in a community, in an environment, in a family, in a circumstance, a context where there were expectations placed on good behaviour, and where that young woman finds herself pregnant and unmarried. And pregnant and being unmarried is deemed to be illegitimate, not being a fit mother because one is not married, and being subjected to that experience in the period of review 1949 to 1976. Mm-hmm. You didn't have access to internet, you didn't have access to information that you could readily access immediately. You went to those who could offer you guidance, and you were immediately told that you were a bad person. Mm-hmm. Contending with that circumstance at that stage of life, stage of development, and that particular circumstance is unimaginable in terms of contending with that reality, a triple whammy of being pregnant out of wedlock, being unmarried, having to attend mother and baby home, and all that goes with that. Zero choice, zero access to information, zero support. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd compliment again Gordon's answer by focusing perhaps on the active role of organisations. So there's a way in two senses that the church at this particular time, so here I refer to the Church of England, but also the Catholic Church and associated denominational voluntary organisations, they saw a role for themselves in the post-war welfare state, where the state was taking increasing action by engaging this kind of so-called moral welfare work. It was seen as their legitimate sphere of activity, that women in that position somehow transgressed norms, and this was the appropriate means of dealing with them as a group. The other side to this, I think, worth raising is the role of the social work profession. At this time, they were in their infancy, but they were professionalising, and the role of fashionable ideas around child development, particularly the work of John Bowlby, was singularly influential. The idea that in order to prevent a disrupted early formative relationship, to be in the best interest of the child, you should separate them as soon as possible from their mother, as a damaging influence upon the child. And that's where you have the constant refrain that so many people have said about their own experience of removal, separation, that if you love your child, you'll give it up. And that is down to intentional actions on behalf of social workers and the profession.
Thank you. So can I ask now, Dr. Greenlees and Dr. Gallen, how comparable were the experiences in Scotland and in Ireland? Were there differences? Was there similarities? Is there anything that you can tell us that helps us to kind of make a comparison?
Certainly in Scotland, the experience is very similar. Unmarried mothers or unmarried women had very few choices. In Scotland, the general practitioner, the GP, also played a huge role in addition to the social worker in mother and baby homes, because many GPs did not believe in prescribing birth control to unmarried women, and also they were instrumental in sending a pregnant unmarried mother to a mother and baby home. There's also quite a lot of cases of them actually telling the parents of the daughter that she's either interested in birth control or B, she's pregnant. So you sort of have the medical element combined with the social element with families, because there was huge fear of the huge disgrace to the family if an unmarried woman became pregnant. So she had few choices. It was basically what happened to her depended on who she encountered in their own perspective, and it all depends on the sympathies of your families, the general practitioner, and sometimes the minister, be it the Church of Scotland, Catholic Church, but also even the smaller denominations in Scotland, the Methodists, the Baptists and things as well, were also involved.
The situation in Ireland is broadly similar. I'd speak to both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland if that might be useful. So in both jurisdictions, I think adoption was playing a role in post-partition nation building, the sense of creating national identity in the Republic very much based on Catholic values. And so anything that was an exception to that, including sex outside marriage and unmarried motherhood, was seen as both nationally problematic and religiously problematic. And the extended role of religious organisations in the provision of social welfare is much deeper than perhaps in England and Wales, where the religious organisations controlled most of the healthcare provision, controlled most of the education provision. And so to echo the earlier points, wherever one would turn, one would face similar probations in terms of shame and stigma and deviating from the moral norms. Mm-hmm. We'd expect to see something similar. We do see something similar in Northern Ireland, but obviously with different denominational framings. Mm-hmm. And I suppose the extent of trying to hide unmarried motherhood was such that we saw processes of trying to repatriate unmarried women who left Ireland to come to England and Wales. So Irish religious orders travelled over to England and Wales for the purposes of bringing those women back, oftentimes to mother and baby institutions, or to engage in processes of adoption of the children.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Darren now for our next question.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. First question is to Dr. Lambert and Professor Harold again. You made a distinction between the practical choices and then the legal choices that could be made. In that same period that we're talking about, 49 to 76, how did the legal framework, such as it was, shape the rights and the obligations of mothers, of children, and of adoptive parents?
Absolutely. So the legal basis of the 49 and 50 Act is about trying to make the process of adoption quicker as far as they are concerned, to expedite the process. So in a way, the background to this is a way there is a large increase in the number of adoptions around the end of the Second World War because of wartime conditions, people expecting to maybe come back and be married and having sex before marriage, then not being able to do that because of a range of circumstances. So the legislation was designed to make that process quicker around processes of consent and how those were obtained from mothers. Again, it was more on a legal basis that the mothers would sign those across, and the courts then through the local authority children's services would act in the best interest of the child on paper, designed to make sure that the adoption was appropriate and the adoptive parents had been appropriately assessed by the religious and adoptive organisations. In reality, that was very much a paper exercise, and I can't think of any examples where that was overturned or prevented effectively. So you've got a system designed effectively around passing the responsibility to these arm's length regulated organisations by the state, also to try and overcome a problematic black market in infants. That is where effectively adoption was taking place outside the purview of the state, and they had no oversight of those, and the adoption legislation was about trying to bring greater oversight to that process, whilst sort of maintaining the spiritual and moral element that went with supervision of households and adoptive parents as well. It's worth noting as well that in the same way that if you were to foster a child during this time, there were certain legal protections that you would have to be criminally vetted. Those didn't apply to adoptive families, and there was no ongoing supervision of the home once the adoption was made from the point of view of the child. So there was a broad legal commitment as part of the 1948 Children Act to provide ongoing supervision from time to time, owing to cost, lack of staff, their own other work. That was very rarely enforced. So you have a situation where effectively, once the child has been adopted and that perfunctory legal basis of the rights of the child and parental authority transferred to the adoptive parents, they were left to their own devices with no meaningful oversight at all.
I can just add that, I think an important component of the process and the legal framework that you referenced and Michael very eloquently summarised is the role of the so-called street-level bureaucrat in implementing what they believe to be the legal framework or requirements or options to an individual or individuals. And Michael mentioned earlier the attachment framework. It was the sort of theory of the day that early attachment, secure attachment, insecure attachment, etc., fundamental to children's development 50s, 60s, and that actually a mother who was not married was not a fit mother, and therefore the child should be taken away immediately, 10 days, 6 weeks for the adoption order. So the system was designed, engineered and implemented with that core objective. This woman, this mother, should not be allowed to engage, bond, experience her child. The child should be taken away and placed with a fit family, a phenotypically fit family. I use the word science lightly here. The science of that, aligning an infant with parents who might look like the infant, perhaps speaks most loudly as to the direction of travel in terms of purpose and the systems that were around that. Families, communities, religious orders, voluntary organisations, and anybody around that young woman who deemed that person not to be fit to be a mother.
It's an interesting concept you raise there with the street-level bureaucrat kind of making those decisions. And I wanted to ask to what extent those different adoption agencies, local authorities, mother and baby homes were complying with statutory requirements versus sort of informal and sort of customary or socialised practices.
Again, there's other people at the panel. I would suggest that those implementing so-called formal or procedural processes would deem that they were doing what they were supposed to do correctly. It's entirely a matter of interpretation. We know that women were not provided with information that under legal guidelines they were entitled to and would have likely significantly shaped their decisions. Again, I use the word decision lightly because the power and control and coercion around a young mother was so potent that actually free will really didn't exist en masse. But those acting in terms of the interests of the state, interests of the legal frameworks, would say they were doing the right thing, irrespective of the mother's interests or the child's interests, importantly.
Did any others have any thoughts, particularly Dr. Greenlees, on this kind of statutory versus very informal or customary practices in the mother and baby homes?
Yes, I can add that firstly that most of what happened in Scotland is quite similar to what happened in England, but there's clear evidence in the archives that the needs of the adoptive parents were prioritised over those of the mother and of the baby. It was what they needed because they had a right to become parents, and if for whatever reason they couldn't, they had a right to become parents, and therefore they had a right to a baby. And it was, and when you read the notes and of some of these organisations, it's almost as if they're like, right, this couple needs a baby, we need to go and find one that would fit in. And there are examples of trying to find a best match for the parents so that they genetically look similar. Nowhere is there evidence of consultation with the mother. Does she want to give up her baby? All the mothers and the records suggest they had no choice. Same as in England. They were not asked if they wanted to give up their baby for adoption. Some were forced to sign documents without knowing what they were. Some did not have any documents, did not sign any documents. The baby was just taken. It was all a system involving charities, religious groups, as well as social workers and the state, and the mother and baby homes, sort of depending who you met. But all the adoptions were arranged without too much input, or if any input, from the mother.
Sounds like the customary still held dominance over the statutory kind of framework that it was operating within.
One point I would wish to add for your understanding is just to make clear that in order to understand that point of mediation between the customary and the statutory, is my research focuses on government archives, and you can see regular courses of meetings within different government departments, so particularly the Home Office, which was responsible for regulating adoption, and the Ministry of Health, which funded the homes, about whose responsibility for inspecting homes, for example, it was, because on paper the statutory basis was that because the children came under the purview of the Home Office, that it should be them doing the inspection, but because the Ministry of Health were paying the bill, it was decided that they would undertake inspections, they were better placed to do so. There's a paper trail around that, and then got a series of inspection files relating to individual homes. So I think you must always bear in mind the clear guiding role of the state in determining how those customs were within acceptable boundaries or not.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jess.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit more about the oversight mechanisms that you've just mentioned to monitor adoption practices during this period? And I think we've heard your answer on this, but I just want to ask again whether these were effective in preventing coercion or malpractice. Dr. Lambert.
I think coercion was baked into the entire system. The idea that there was a legal basis by which you could argue from the organisation's point of view that due process had been followed, informed consent had been obtained, and throughout everyone was making an active, conscious choice is a misrepresentation of what took place. That the power that the state, the social workers, the religious organisations had over that whole decision-making process was such that consent was pretty hollow and pretty vacuous and meaningless throughout, that the system was designed to supply infants to adoptive families. It wasn't designed to make someone come to the best decision possible under the circumstances in which they operated.
Is there any evidence of mothers being misinformed or pressured or denied the opportunity to withdraw their consent?
I think there are definitely two sources of information on this. There is a significant volume of files within the Home Office archive records where they talk about instances of this and about mothers trying to then appeal to have their child returned, and that local health authorities or religious organisations were asking for advice about how to respond to that, and clearly that wasn't then being followed, so that effectively the government's interpretation of that position was that once the child had been passed over, once due process in their eyes had been followed, that was the end of the matter as far as they were concerned. You've also got to remember there's a widespread recognition this time about the lack of choice. So there's one document I think that betrays this in particular, that there is an umbrella organisation called the Standing Conference of Societies Registered for Adoption, which represented most of the large organisations, and they wrote a document to the government in 1951, effectively saying that mothers had no meaningful choice, no conscious decision on their part to give up the child or not, and that decision was taken away from them. So this is the view of the adoption agencies at the time. They write this to the government, and the response is ultimately that the current system is working quite happily, and they leave it as it is.
Just very briefly, I mean, it could be summarised that the system was designed to punish and place. Unmarried mother is to be punished, child is to be placed. And all of the processes that a young mother and child experience were built around those two core objectives: fundamentally place, but punish. It was a platform, an era of chronic, calculated trauma delivery. And that's what must be understood in trying to understand what young women and mothers, children have gone through throughout the period of JCHR inquiry and since.
Thank you. Dr. Greenlees or Dr. Glenn?
Yes, just to add to that from the Scottish perspective, all the interactions and oral histories I've conducted with people affected by forced adoption, none of them have mentioned having a choice about giving up their child. It was all coercion. Some resisted, some wanted it back, some were actually planning to marry the father, and they still had no choice. The baby was taken. It was punish the mother and place the baby and the needs of the adopted parents.
Situations very similar in Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. We see low-level civil servants seeking to advocate to departments about the need to reform mother and baby institutions or to ensure efforts to provide more effective consent, and these are ignored at central level. We see processes where the legal parameters of the adoption system were entirely circumvented through a process of illegal birth registration, where the adoptive parents were put down as the birth or natural parents on a birth certificate, making tracing impossible. This is in both Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, with some of the religious orders that are in this jurisdiction. So again, I think that gives us cause to explore whether that would be true as well. But the central point, I think, is that the lack of effective consent is a very broad regional norm across these organisations. And this has made it incredibly difficult for people to engage in processes of information retrieval or engage in processes of tracing. We have instances, including the very famous case of Philomena Lee, where people are looking for information, are denied that information on both sides, so both the child and adopted mother or birth natural mother are looking for information, and the religious organisation fails to provide it. So it's a very pervasive problem.
Thank you. I want to ask about reunions or the inability to reunite. How has that shaped the lives of mothers and their adopted children, Professor Harold?
Deeply traumatic. I was sitting here reflecting, it's 2026. We're 50 years outside the end of the JCHR inquiry period, 49 to 76. Imagine 50 years. And I mentioned that, if you like, the triple whammy around the realm of self-blame. Pregnant, not married, being forced to place a child for adoption, and then wondering lifelong, how is my child? The best way to answer that question is it's a natural bond, and that natural bond has been interrupted forcibly for decades. Among evidence working specifically with women, mothers in mother and baby homes, one study, 300 mothers over an extended period of time, 80% had experienced clinically significant depression, about 20% in the general population, and 20% had attempted suicide, about 8% in the general population. So if you look at those type of long-term outcomes and all that goes with those long-term outcomes, this is trauma in the extreme. And separation from child and separation from information around child and separation of children from information around birth parents, parenting, is trauma in the extreme.
Can I ask, what are the implications of increased access to DNA and ancestry testing for individuals affected by historical forced adoption?
Significant. It's really an emerging realm of new knowledge. The science around contemporary molecular genetics is far more reliable than it was even a decade or so ago. So highly significant in terms of identifying birth-parent links, but importantly around health. Again, those through closed adoption were not permitted access to records that would be significant potentially in terms of health and health development and health of children, future generations. So significant in the positive, significant in terms of other challenges, and an area that requires very, very careful regulation and effective guidance in interpreting what genetic and heritability and genetic linkage actually represents and means.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment? No. Thank you.
Peter.
Thank you. I, as well as sitting on this committee, I sit on the Joint Committee of Human Rights, although I was not a member when it published its report in 2022, but I want to turn to that now and ask what progress the government has made in implementing the committee's recommendations. In particular, recommendations were made on access to adoption records, the sharing of medical information, complaint mechanisms and notification processes for birth mothers. What progress has been made on implementing these recommendations? Perhaps we'll start with you, Dr. Lambert.
Absolutely. I would say precious little, to be frank. I think there are a series of quite cost-limited recommendations that were made as a result of that, as you've identified, designed to improve and ameliorate existing processes of reconnection information and the legal rights of access to those sorts of information. But I can't think, through the appeals that the campaigning organisations have made to the Department for Education repeatedly over the last 3 or 4 years, that they've occurred in any meaningful way. So I think not a great deal would be my blunt answer.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think there were 20 primary recommendations. I would endorse Michael's answer. I don't see evidence of clear progress around any of those recommendations. I would flag one around access to therapeutic services, both in terms of preventing Ofsted from, or working to prevent Ofsted from blocking access to therapeutic services. Just to make one point, when it comes to therapeutic service, particularly trauma-informed service, where an individual is a victim, can conclude that they are not the cause of their experiences, therapeutic service may be effective. To offer therapeutic service in the context of the trauma that mothers, children, families have experienced here without the presence of apology is actually condemning that strategy to failure.
And turn to that apology now, because of course that was one of the recommendations of the report as well, saying that there are some things only a government can do. Right. Following the call for that formal apology, the then Conservative government in 2023 said that issuing an apology would not be appropriate, as the state did not actively support these practices. Just to really reiterate what I think we've already heard today, do you agree with that assessment?
No. In terms of the not offering the apology assessment?
In terms of the assessment that it wouldn't be appropriate because the state did not support these practices?
That is not correct, and evidence shows very clearly the state was in the engine room of those practices, if not necessarily at the wheel.
Dr. Lambert?
I think the statement the government issued is a misrepresentation of the facts, of history, of the truth, that the state was central to what took place, and without it, when the funding stopped, when the legislation changed, adoption declined very, very quickly of the nature of it. The state was absolutely central. To say otherwise is completely untrue.
Serena.
Thank you. This question is for Dr. Greenlees. In March 2023, the First Minister issued an apology for the Scottish Government, on behalf of the Scottish Government, for historical forced adoption practices. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about the process that led to that apology?
Yes, the process really started around the time of the Australian apology and also the Irish apology. There's protracted media campaigns, and the acting minister in 2015, the acting minister of Children and Families, met with Origins Scotland and the Movement for Adoption Apology, the Scottish branch, to hear the case for the Scottish Government giving an apology and to take steps to address the injustices done to the families and everyone affected by historic forced adoption. Very little happened after that. In 2021, a different representative from MAA Scotland and Origin Scotland met with Minister Claire Hockey to make the same case, but at the same time they also included recommendations that included the need for apology as only one part of reparation that included rehabilitation, restitution, and other elements of satisfaction. And as you mentioned, in March of 2023, the then First Minister Nicola Sturgeon did issue a heartfelt apology, and that apology was welcomed. However, the people affected expected a series of concrete measures in reparation to follow, and yet all that was introduced was a new peer support services which had been put in place prior to the apology, and they committed $145,000 to the peer support services, nothing to deal with the trauma, nothing to deal with finding out, as you were talking about a few minutes ago, finding families, and nothing about finding out the truth about what happened, or indeed the human rights violations that occurred.
Yes, so a number of campaigners have certainly raised that meaningful actions haven't been followed up from this. So what barriers have prevented such measures from taking place, in your opinion?
In my opinion, lack of government will. In Scotland and also in Britain, the Scottish Office and the British Home Office were all involved in supporting mother and baby homes financially, and through support of, turning a blind eye to what was happening really, and not regulating the homes. Lack of possibly cost, I don't know about that, but a lack of will, I think. I don't think there's a real desire to do the investigation. Certainly in 2025, members of MAA Scotland and myself, we actually met with the current First Minister, John Swinney. He said there wouldn't be no public inquiry, but he did allude to the fact that there could be an oral history project, and we put forward the case, look, it has to be a proper truth recovery project. You have to look at what really happened, and you need legislation to preserve the records, and you need to do a proper project to find out what happened on all sides, as well as the oral history. It's all important. And there seemed to be a divide between the government and those affected by the historic adoption practices. The First Minister's interest was in wider recognition and education, to acknowledge the past, and survivors who want the full truth to be told, including the roles of institutions and public bodies, including the Scottish Office and the British Home Office. Basically, they want the truth.
Thank you.
Mark.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Gallen, very similar question. In 2021, the Irish government issued an apology to the survivors of mother and baby homes for the profound generational wrong that was inflicted upon them. What steps led to that apology?
So the apology follows the day after the publication of the Commission of Investigation report into mother and baby homes. That report followed a multi-year process, 2015 to 2021, investigating those homes, and county homes, the successor to workhouses. The apology was issued without survivor consultation or engagement with survivors. The apology does not mention the word adoption. The apology does not frames the Commission report as the definitive account of what took place in those institutions, and as a result was received quite poorly by survivors who queried the report's findings as to the lack of coercive adoptions in those institutions, and the lack of, among other things, institutional racism. So the apology is a significant moment. We have a number of apologies in the Republic of Ireland, and it was accompanied by a number of material elements of redress. So later that year, the government published an action plan for survivors, 22 actions across 8 themes, including access to personal information, reform of archives, and the provision of redress. If I could, the better practice of apology in these islands, it comes in Northern Ireland in 2022. Following the recommendation of the Hart Inquiry to provide an apology, the government there adopted international best practice for an apology using the 5 elements of a sincere or thoughtful apology. And this was as a result of significant survivor advocacy and engagement. Survivors had key words they wanted to see in the apology. I would encourage this committee to view an apology as a process and not in a single event. And the process matters as much as the outcome. The involvement of people, the respect people are given, the way in which they are spoken to and brought into the process makes a meaningful difference. And I'd be happy to provide text of the key components of an apology in writing to the committee.
That's fine. Why did the Irish government make those mistakes in the build-up to the apology then?
The Irish government has sought to maintain a degree of control over the justice responses to non-recent institutional abuses, and so it has periodically engaged in meaningful consultations But like in Scotland, and I think in other jurisdictions, there's two factors that shape or restrict their response. The first is fear of cost. And there's a recognition that these were large-scale institutions, 57,000 children, and an equivalent number of mothers. That's just in mother and baby homes, and a larger universe of adopted people. So they're very concerned about potential legal liability. The other side of it, I think, is and we heard it at the start, shame, is the idea that by addressing the past, it calls into question national reputation and calls into question national identity. And this is really regrettable, because an apology and justice measures in dealing with the past are in fact a mechanism to renew the sense of who we are and our civic values, to acknowledge where they have been failed, and that we can, by our actions today, make a better expression of values such as decency, fair play, and treating people with respect.
Accounting for what you've said about the build-up to the apology and then the apology itself, obviously several measures have been put in place, and you referenced them in your answer. Since that apology was given. Two that I want to reference here, the Birth Information and Tracing Act, and also the Mother and Baby Compensation Scheme, the Institution Compensation Scheme. How effective have they been in addressing the needs of survivors?
The Birth Information and Tracing Act has been very well received. There's over 17,000 applications made under it. The Adoption Authority of Ireland and other bodies that are empowered under the legislation have used their statutory powers to draw in some private records held by religious organisations to enable adoption information to be received, and it provides for a free statutory tracing service for affected persons. So that has taken a significant step forward in terms of the previous position that existed in Ireland. Where we are, I think, coming into restrictions or limitations in that is there's a cross-border element to some adoptions, and indeed there's a across the Irish Sea component as well in terms of adoption information. So I think the need for data sharing between the governments in Dublin and Stormont and perhaps here may come forward in the future. In terms of redress, this has been very heavily criticised for excluding the majority of adopted people. This has excluded anybody who was not resident in a mother and baby home for less than 180 days. And you can see a clear cost calculation being at play here in terms of the government's thinking. They projected an overall cost of 1.6 billion. And budgeted only for 800 million, with I think the suggestion that the private bodies, the religious orders, would make a financial contribution. That process went through mediation on behalf of the state, but ultimately no offer was made. This year we've gathered figures that only approximately 55 million of the budget for redress has been paid out to survivors based on the number of applications. We're dealing with people from, in this case, 1998 right back to 1922. It's important to look at the rates of mortality, but also the rates of travel. People leave environments where they've been deeply shamed. And so people might be eligible for the scheme in other jurisdictions, including this one, and not sought to access that payment.
Absolutely. And just finally from me on this, what about the mental health of the survivors? Has the apology or any of the subsequent actions had any positive impact on that? What more could be done in this area?
The process of what we've described was deeply traumatic at the time it took place, but sadly there have been subsequent and secondary forms of re-traumatization by the way in which people have sought to seek their information and the way in which they've been obliged to advocate with the state. So to oblige people who have gone through horrific events to lobby again and again to the government has been deeply traumatizing, and the way in which some of them have been spoken to or interrogated at public inquiries has also been very problematic. So we heard the phrase trauma-informed earlier, very easy to say, but very important that it's implemented in practice at a level of protocol for public inquiry, for redress, and indeed for adoption information. What I've seen globally, and I've looked at this in a book in 2023, best practice is for the provision of a wraparound service, a single point of contact that's subject to specialist training that knows the type of issues that affected people are likely to bring forward and can advocate on their behalf. So the Find and Connect service in Australia, I think, reflects international best practice.
Incredibly helpful, thank you. Dr. Greenlees, just following up on Dr. Gallen's answers, is there anything more you want to say about the impact of the apology in Scotland, about anything about the process or impact it had on the survivors after it was given?
Yes, can I just add, in the process and run up to it, the Scottish Government did commission some research, but they did it through one of these organizations, research organizations, and unfortunately that was a poor choice of research committees. And when you look at the output, which is available online, it has clearly been shaped by the Scottish Government, because it comes to the conclusion that it was society that was responsible for what happened. And I think that influences the Scottish Government's reluctance now to follow up after the apology and to introduce measures and around a human rights framework even of finding out the truth, preserving the documents. You probably are aware of the BirthLink disaster in 2023 and 27 filing cabinets of documents being shredded. And so, I think their reluctance stems partly from the research that was done before and the belief that it is a societal issue rather than involving governments at all levels.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Dr. Gallen, I think we would really appreciate a further note from you if you're happy to provide that on that process. What we are most keen to do as a committee is to get to recommendations that would have meaningful impact for those who are most directly affected. Absolutely. So it would be very helpful to have that. Thank you. Caroline.
Thank you. So this is a sort of final wrap-up question to all of you. As we've said, the Joint Committee on Human Rights has recommended that the government issue an apology, and Dr. Gallen, you've spoken very powerfully about how that can be done in the most meaningful way, and that there are different kinds of apology. So perhaps I could start with Professor Harold. What do you see the potential benefits to the birth mothers of the UK government providing an apology?
To pick up on Dr. Gallen's example in Australia, and to think about the world of trauma and those who've experienced trauma. We know from trauma-informed related research in contexts not focused on mother and baby homes, victims of physical, sexual abuse, military contexts, conflict contexts, that guilt, shame, self-blame are features of experience. And once the perception of guilt, shame, self-blame is present with respect to experience, the potential for intervention is significantly reduced. So apology starts the process of recovery trajectory. Without apology, when we're speaking at the human cost level here, without apology, victims, mothers and children and others cannot begin the process of recovery. Until that happens, everything else around redress is an academic discussion. But we're talking about human cost and human recovery, and therefore apology activates that process.
Just be explicit about what you mean. You're saying to us that being told from the institutions that were responsible that it was not your fault is a fundamental prerequisite for psychological recovery and coming to terms with what happened.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Dr. Lambert, anything you'd like to add?
I'd wish to make 2 points about the apology and its role. That I think you have to bear in mind that the role of the adoptive system, mother-baby homes, was to enable women who pass through their doors to come out the other side with a blank slate to start again and rebuild their own new lives. That was predicated on never speaking of what happened again and putting the whole episode behind you and the long-standing trauma that women have carried with them throughout, but also their children, and that moment of separation has been incredibly profound. And the ability to put on the public record that this wasn't society, this was an active decision by the state, by religious organisations in your best interests, that this was something done to you rather than something over which you had a meaningful say or choice and control, I think is incredibly powerful in changing the public understanding of the past, because that has profound ramifications for reunions. That rather than those emotional weights of why was I given up? Nobody loved me. I was passed and chosen by another family. It then changes the record to say, actually, that is a misrepresentation of what has taken place. I would also like to really emphasise the point that an apology, which is words alone without action, is completely hollow, meaningless and sometimes more harmful. That in a way that the Catholic Church formally apologised for their role in this in 2016 and have done absolutely nothing since. They've taken no action, no redress, no changes to their processes. People are still trying to access records now under the same processes, and that for me is more insulting than doing something around it. So Dr. Gallen's point around process, I think, is absolutely integral.
It's got to be more than just words.
Correct.
Thank you. And in closing, what are the most important actions that you believe this committee should recommend to the government following today's discussion?
Apology. But apology with action. There are examples of apology and inaction at a government level. There are examples of apology and action at a government and a system level, providing access to relevant services on the back of an apology. Australia is perhaps the best example. I'm very happy to follow up with examples if helpful to the committee on that particular point. And to look at good practice in a good practice is an odd term to say when we're speaking about decades of engineered trauma. But it's time to redress and redirect.
There isn't much time left, is there?
There isn't much time left, and that's a very, very fair point. But apology to a victim who can identify, I am not the architect, I am a victim, is a starting place. And you have the time and opportunity to do that through this committee today.
I think providing some kind of accountability is integral in a way that there was a lot of expectation around the recommendations of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, and they will be taken forward. And effectively, because it cuts across several government departments' spheres of responsibility, in many ways it's fallen between the cracks, and it's been left in many ways to campaigners and advocates to push for any kind of voice or action. So I think the ability of this committee to hold the government to account on this issue, whilst there is still time, is incredibly important in a way that to date that simply hasn't really taken place.
I would agree with both what Gordon and Michael have said, but I would also add, you need the formal apology, but you also need to find out the truth. The apology with action, find out the truth, establish the facts about what happened on a government level as well as the people who ran the mother and baby homes and the local authority. And to do that, you need to also legislate for the preservation of records so that they don't get destroyed, and records of the homes, but also the adoption records, the papers regarding these families, so that they can be, hopefully one day, more can be done to help them find out about themselves, the human rights framework around all this. Basically, I'll keep it brief.
I think the first thing is to ensure that the people who are affected by this are heard. And that their priorities and their needs are understood and listened to and are documented. So a meaningful process of consultation at this committee and more broadly, I think it's really, really important to have an evidence base for informing policy. The second thing is to think about if there is to be an apology, what is it an apology for? Are you to make a broad statement like Micheál Martin for a generational wrong, but do so in a manner that upsets survivors by not naming the particular harms or particular wrongs that they say happened to them or that are experienced? Now, naturally, there's a huge variation in what people experience, but further investigation might be necessary for an apology to be meaningful for the people that you are speaking to. As a result, then, the sequencing of an apology with the other potential justice measures that are available is important. And I note the Joint Committee's report and subsequent report by Professor Neil speaking about the costs that come to individuals at the moment in terms of tracing. Well, one of the changes in the birth and information tracing legislation in Ireland is to provide a free statutory tracing service and to reduce that cost barrier. That can exist as a form of redress for affected people if you've been finding it difficult to find out who you are, to find out whether someone wants contact with you, to provide that for free as a form of acknowledging that wrong took place. The final point I would make is that the question of state responsibility need not be either or. State responsibility sits in a nest with the responsibility of communities, of private voluntary organisations, and sadly also with families. And so a really thorough apology would narrate the complex ways in which these young women and their children were failed by many sectors of society simultaneously. And part of the role of leadership and political leadership, I think, will be doing so in a manner that invites the other organisations to make similar apologies, to contribute financially to forms of redress, but also invites society today to reflect upon their histories and to start conversations and dialogue about who we are, who we say we are, and how we can do better. Thank you.
Peter, you want to go?
Dr. Gallen, is what you're describing there a co-creation of the apology?
Very much so. So we've seen the co-design model used particularly in Northern Ireland, where the independent panel model is currently concluding its work to establish recommendations for how to deal with mother and baby homes and Magdalen laundries in that institution, which will sit alongside a statutory public inquiry. So in Ireland it became quite glib, but one minister took to using the phrase "nothing for us without us." And so we should not have processes that remain elite or expert level, but rather meaningfully engage affected people. And I'm aware that there's a victim survivor consultation mechanism in the ICSA inquiry, for instance. So it's not as if this jurisdiction hasn't taken steps in that direction before, but further mechanisms I think could go forward to ensure there's meaningful buy-in across the spectrum of experience.
Thank you. Thank you all very, very much for being with us this morning. It's been enormously helpful to the committee to have your evidence. We are doing this piece of work quickly, and we're doing that because we feel the urgency of survivors and the kind of passing of generations who've been affected by this. But we want also to do it as rigorously as possible. So I would really encourage you, if there is further information that we didn't have time to discuss today, or information that can supplement what you've told us today, please do write to the committee. We would very, very much welcome that. But thank you all very much for being with us. You're very welcome to sit and observe the rest of our evidence session this morning if you'd like to. Thank you. Welcome back to our second part to our oral evidence session this morning on historical forced adoptions. Can I welcome our second panel of witnesses to the committee this morning? Before I invite you to introduce yourselves to us, one of our members would like to make a declaration. Jess.
I'm Jess Sarto MP. I just wanted to declare my interest having formerly worked at Barnardo's.
Thank you very much. Can I invite you now to introduce yourselves to us, to make any opening statements that you'd like to, and I'll start with Emily Frith.
Thank you. I'm Emily Frith. I'm Chief Executive of Adoption UK. We're an adoption support charity which exists to make sure that those unable to grow up their birth parents have the right support in childhood and an equal opportunity to thrive as adults. And we're here particularly to talk about our work of the Adoption Barometer, which is a survey of those affected by adoption, prospective adopters, adoptive families and adult adoptees. Thank you.
Thank you. Brenda Farrell.
Brenda Farrell, UK Director of Fostering and Adoption, Children in Care with Barnardo's. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. And obviously Barnardo's a very large UK-wide based children's charity, but obviously today the lens is very much of our work in adoption and the archive that we keep across our Making Connections service, supporting children that we've cared for, but obviously those that have been adopted through the organisation.
Thank you. Peter Forrest.
Peter Forrest, the Chief Executive of the Salvation Army in the United Kingdom and Ireland. Recognising that the Salvation Army has not been an adoption society, but we have run a number of children's homes, mother and baby homes, of which adoptions were taking place over the years.
Thank you. Emily Crowther-Duncan.
Hi, my name's Emma Crowther-Duncan. I'm the National Development Lead at PAC-UK. PAC-UK is a voluntary adoption support agency, and my work is with adopted adult adoptees around access to records, intermediary and also birth relative counselling.
Thank you very much. I'll begin our questioning this morning. Could I ask each of you to say how you would characterise adoption practices between 1949 and 1976, particularly in relation to the pressures that were faced on unmarried mothers? And I might start with Emily, if that's okay.
Yes, I guess that the angle that we come to this from is the impact that this had on the children who are now adults who were adopted at the time. Often I think the conversations around an apology can be focused on the impact on mothers, and that is very important too. But I think we recognise that because of the societal narratives around adoption being a happy ending, there's often a lack of understanding of the lifelong impact of adoption. So it can impact on people in a range of ways: when they are teenagers, when you have your first child, when you encounter a health condition in adulthood and are asked about your family medical history, at times like the menopause, or when a parent passes away. So adoption has a lifelong impact, and it has had a lifelong impact on those affected during this era, which went, I think, beyond 1976 and into the 80s. And it's important, we think, that an apology really recognises that, and recognises that adoption is still happening to those adults today.
Thank you. Brenda, Farrell.
Barnardo's in itself did not directly provide mother and baby units, but obviously during that time was involved in adoptions, primarily those with consent of mothers, and our records show that consent was written at that time. However, we have, post that era, continued to offer support to both the adult adoptee and the children through our Making Connection service, which manages our archives, and with the very clear focus that we made a commitment to those children and those adult adoptees and birth families to offer support. And that model of understanding of when members of the public who have been adopted through Barnardo's, that we provide a therapeutic, supportive and counselling service to ensure that if any records are shared, that they are shared with the sensitivity and process that has been reflected in previous speakers and that is required.
We heard from our previous witnesses very strong evidence based on their very rigorous academic research that there was no meaningful consent during the period that we're talking about today. So it is concerning to me, and I imagine to other members of the committee as well, to hear that your primary narrative for what happened and Barnardo's role in it involved mothers who had consented to their adoption, when the academic evidence would tell us that that simply wasn't the case. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes. From our records, we are aware that the ethos of Barnardo's at that time was one to work with and support mothers who found themselves either in our children's homes who may become pregnant. And the ethos of our work was to work with them, to support them and their children. So in those instances where Barnardo's would have been approached by another agency in which to place their child in adoption, they would only do so with the consent, the written consent as we had it at that time within that context. And at that time, that's what the organisation was requiring, that there was written consent, and that was checked before those children were then going on to be adopted through Barnardo's.
There is a difference that I think we heard about from our previous witnesses between a piece of paper that may have been signed or a conversation that was reported to take place, and whether that was a meaningful choice for the mothers concerned. Has your organisation undertaken any reflection on the extent to which consent was a tick box exercise or consent was meaningfully given?
Yes, of course. Barnardo's have been involved in other inquiries with the other nations, and we have gone through our records, and obviously with that lens we are highly sensitive in understanding of the circumstances of that time which you reflect on.
And from your records, can you tell what was the proportion of young women who became pregnant whilst in a Barnardo's children's home who were able to keep their babies?
I wouldn't have the stats, but I have. It would have been all of the children that we understand whether they're with them being underage mothers when they did become pregnant, the ethos and what was written within our policies and procedures at that time was that we would support that young mother and that mother when they left Barnardo's home to support in raising of their children, to keep them together.
Thank you. Peter Forrest.
Salvation Army has been caring for all people of all descriptions since 1890 in particular with regard to mother and baby homes. And although we might be only a small operation in this whole process, our records show us that the overriding principle that we had in that time was to encourage to keep together the mother and the child unless exceptional circumstances, which would we clearly not be able to do that. Of all of the babies that were born in our homes, only a third were adopted. So we were able to show from our records that 2/3 of the babies born in that set of circumstances were actually kept with the mother, and the mother went on to live a family life with that child. So we know that because of the extensive records that we've got in our International Heritage Centre in Denmark Hill. But also, we, being a quasi-military organisation in its birth in the 1865s, we're writing up orders and regulations for culture and behaviour. The 1920 orders and regulations for mother and baby homes states that the ruling principle is to keep the mother and the baby together. We were not part of that significant, what we've heard already today, of that put the baby to adoption. We can attest that from the historic records that we've got. We also have records of the consent, accepting what has been said about consent, but we have those records as well.
So I think Dr. Lambert's research in particular would point to a kind of slightly different narrative of Salvation Army involvement at that time, both in relation to the sort of social work role that the organisation played and moral welfare officers and that type of activity. And we've heard this morning his evidence about the collusion of many different organisations, including religious organisations, alongside the state and other voluntary sector organisations in a situation that led to no meaningful choice for women. How do you explain your organisation's narrative, which is very much at odds with the kind of prevailing narrative coming from independent academic research that's looked at the role of a whole variety of different organisations at the time?
The role of the Salvation Army, particularly in this particular era, was we picked up those who really had nowhere else to go, the lowest and the least in society. And we gave to them an opportunity for a clean and safe space in which to have their child. And in that safe space, the encouragement to keep that child. And because we were operating quite independently, we were not an adoption agency, we were a mother and baby home, looking after the baby and the mother, our records show that people would stay for quite a long time in our homes, which then they would have that facility and the benefit of the cohesion with the baby to develop that relationship and go on to live a normal life.
And of course the existence of the mother and baby homes is not a kind of neutral fact in this period of our history, that those homes, it's not a usual thing for a mother to leave her home because she's pregnant and to go into an institution where she is subject to advice and pressure and whatever the prevailing narratives were at the time. The existence of those homes is a product and a part of the system. So I think on the basis of the evidence that we have heard, we would reject the a narrative that says that the mother and baby homes were a kind of benign and a neutral part of the system. That's not what the historical evidence says. The historical evidence says that this is a system of a systematic collusion of many different parts of society to create a set of circumstances that were deeply traumatic for many of the women who went through it. Have you undertaken that kind of reflection on the wider period of history and the role that the organisation played?
I think throughout our organisation's history that we have been there for the person who's got nowhere else to go to, and that's not just in the mother and baby homes, that's in our hostels for both men and women. There's a variety of opportunities that the Salvation Army has stepped into because it's seen the need. And I would imagine, and from our history suggests, that the need was there for the young lady who had fallen pregnant and ostracised from home. Where does she go? We were the alternative at the time for those who came into our sphere, either a backstreet abortionist or a life on the street, and we provided that space to be able to
the need was there, as we've really clearly heard, because of the moral, religious and institutional and governmental narratives about what it meant to be an unmarried mother, which made terrible, inaccurate and entirely wrong judgments on those people. So stepping in to provide, the organisation didn't challenge those narratives. It became a part of an acceptance that there was nowhere to go, but because it was in some way a normal thing that those women were ostracised, and providing those institutions it was a part of the narrative. I mean, that's what the historical analysis tells us now, that it was a system working together that involved many different institutions and organisations, but at the root of it was a narrative about what unmarried women were and whose choice it was that they got into that situation, that I think we would mostly now entirely reject.
I would say that our history suggests that we have raised concerns over many things. In the early days of the Salvation Army, laws were changed because of the legislation that we suggested that needed changing. So I'm personally not aware of anything that we did in that time, going back into the late 1900s, but I'm not qualified to suggest anything other than we met a need. The need was there, and although I would suggest that we were not colluding, we were challenging by virtue of our existence, by the fact that we chose to provide those beds for those ladies who needed it. That in itself was a challenge to the authorities of the day.
I'll leave it there for now, but we may return to some of those themes and come to Emma Crowther-Duncan. Thank you.
In our work, we see people that have been, with evidence from the research, the archival records, lived experience testimonies, and the work that we do demonstrates that, the experiences were typical rather than, exceptional. Unmarried mothers often faced judgment, exclusion, threat of being asked to leave the family, homes, institutions. Housing and financial support was minimal, inaccessible, meaning many women were presented with very limited practical options. We see that the practices between the mid-40s and 70s were systemic, they were widespread and characteristic of the policy and professional culture and societal norms of that period. We also see in our work that some of this did creep into the 80s as well, and it wasn't entirely stopped at 1975.
I just wanted to ask, both you and Emily raised that issue about the kind of continuation of practices beyond 1976, and that's of interest to us as a committee because there's a question about scope, and I just wondered if you would like to share any more information with us about what that looked like and how quickly things moved following the change in legislation in 1976.
It's not an area we've done extensive research on. We've just heard from adult adoptees that have experienced that history, that it went beyond that period of time.
Mm-hmm. Our evidence is also anecdotal in the work that we've been doing, in the files that we receive, and the wording within those documentations. It's still incredibly shameful and blaming, and when we have had reunions, birth mothers have told us that they were still coerced and felt that they had no option. And this is, still, like I say, into the early 1980s. But again, anecdotal evidence.
Thank you very much. Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Going back to Brenda and Peter, please can you tell us about the adoption records that your organisations hold? And can you also tell us what type of information is typically available in these records? I'll start with Brenda, if that's okay.
Yes. Our Making Connection department is our archives for Barnardo's, and overall as the Children's Services we have 10,000 records. If we look at a period in time when we consolidated our records from about 2006, since then we've had over 4,000 inquiries from members of the public in relation to following up on their adoption records. So during that time, that's given us an opportunity to review the material and the information, because obviously within those 4,000, half of those were people who were adopted through Barnardo's, and over 800 were family members, birth relatives of those who were adopted through Barnardo's, and the remaining amount related to those who had been adopted through another agency, so they were signposted onwards. Our archivists at Barnardo's, as like colleagues have reflected, the records do show the language of that time, which was, as people have described, which was judgmental decisions were made, very matter of fact. There was very limited detail about the emotional welfare of the birth mother and or the children. However, Barnardo's as an organisation ensured that the breadth of documents were kept. So the detail that we have is very thorough, and I know it's been used by a number of researchers to help understand that period of time. And that's informed the service we now provide when people come forward to view their records. We have a team that specifically trains social workers who ensure that they provide a very trauma-informed and therapeutic lens when anybody comes forward to view those records, because they must be delivered with the sensitivity and understanding and explanation of what would have happened within that time, but in full recognition, as colleagues have already mentioned, about the impact for the individuals seeking out those records.
Okay. We'll return to that, but Peter first. What records do you hold?
Very similar. The fact that we're not an adoption agency, the records would just show which adoption agency the child went to, and sometimes would say a little bit more about the family, about the mother, but generally speaking, the names and the circumstances are there extensively, but not any reference to where the child ended up ultimately. And that's because we weren't the intermediary and just doing that. But similar sort of thing, we get about 100 requests a year for records, and we have a very similar approach to what Brenda's just outlined.
What kind of things does it say about the mother in those records?
I would need to get back to you on that, because each one is very different, but they are detailed. I have seen them, and they're detailed, but as per each one, I would need to get back to you.
Yeah, would you be able to do that? Is that okay? Yeah, after you've reviewed the records, that'd be incredibly helpful. Just as a follow-up then to this, so what gaps are in these records that make it harder for adoptees or birth families to understand or reconstruct their personal histories? Peter, you've answered this in part already. I'll go back to Brenda. What's missing?
I think from a Barnardo's perspective, with local authorities or other agencies approaching Barnardo's to place children, some of the records will remain with that agency. So the records will begin from the point in which Barnardo's have become involved. So that is a gap. How do we join up that connection for individuals when they come forward? And that is so important because it's the full picture. Somebody takes that step in their personal life to come forward to find records. Now, what we do at Barnardo's is we've built up a degree of contact and expertise to be able to work with other agencies and local authorities, so that when we are approached, and we will always get back to people within 3 to 5 months. So within that time, it's about being able, with PACE, to contact those other agencies so we can bring as much records together as possible for that individual. So when we meet with them to share with their records and tell their story, we can do as much as we can in the most thorough way with the full picture as much as possible. But that will be one of the biggest gaps for us.
Understood. And then Peter, is there anything you want to add about the gaps in the records and how it can help people reconstruct their personal history?
We also have a family tracing agency, and that's been operative now for 150 years, so we are quite skilled at finding people. The indications are that finding the record is the beginning of a long process, and it's not just I've got those details and therefore I can go and seek. And it is done professionally. We have a dedicated team at our International Heritage Centre, also our family tracing. So we do have gaps, we acknowledge that, but of the day, the important thing was to record the mother and where the child ended up, and that was with an adoption agency, who would have those details or not, I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much. And then I've just got a question for Emily and Emma, if that's okay. How would you describe the condition and overall completeness of adoption records for those adopted before 1976?
So our research asks all adult adoptees for their information about how they access their records, and successive barometers have shown that the support available is inconsistent and sometimes non-existent. The records are often incomplete, heavily redacted, or missing altogether. So access to records is something that comes up a huge amount within the barometer. People describe being passed from pillar to post. They describe the process as wearying. One example is somebody who was adopted in Wales but then moved as an adult and was told they were passed between both agencies to try and find the records, but finally found someone who would add them to a waiting list, waited months, approached the agency again and was told that that person had left and had not added them to the waiting list, and they would have to go to the back of the queue. And at that point they gave up because they found it too exhausting and wearying. And just a quote that in the barometer, and I think that sums this up really well, said, "It's a hopeless process. There are not enough people with the time to look, and nobody seems to know where to look. My most important personal records and I are being treated as if none of this matters, the story of my whole life as an adoptee." I think that really sums up what people say in the barometer.
Incredible.
The CALG research really highlights and aligns with our view that access to records is difficult, both practically and emotionally for adults. It can become traumatic, it can be dehumanising due to the fragmented processes and inconsistent handling across local authorities and agencies. The record keeping practices vary wildly, with records stored in disparate locations, lacking kind of coordinated digital preservation. We often hear that files have been lost in a fire or a flood, and these are people's histories, and it feels that these barriers are just consistent for people, and it shouldn't be.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. Thanks.
I've got Peter and then Jess, and then we'll go to Caroline.
Yeah, Ms. Farrell, you described the process of mothers contacting Barnardos, and I assume that when they do so, they set out their own experience and their own view of what has happened to them. Do they typically reflect your characterisation of their adoption journey as one of consent?
As one of consent?
Yes.
I haven't personally, but in speaking with our archivists, in understanding the journey from others, I think their understanding of the situation is being very much about their own personal experience.
Yeah, that's
been highlighted
about
today. Yes, and so therefore, each individual case, their own reflections, will be very much about their journey, and a lot of it will be about, because under the present legal system, they cannot access their child's records. They would become obviously looking for some tracing for their own situation. Barnardo's, as I say, we wouldn't have removed babies from mothers. So it would be those mothers who come to us in searching for connection with their children. And to do that, we most usually have to go back to the local authority and scope their records, and then working with the authority ensure that they can get access to their records for their experiences as mothers of that time who had their children removed. Our records primarily relate to the children which were placed for adoption with Barnardo.
With respect, Ms. Farrell, I didn't ask about the records. I asked about the birth mother's expression of their own experience and how that has been related to Barnardo's. Very simple question. When they describe their experience that they went through, do they say that they consented to the process that they have been a part of? Do they use that language of consent? Typically,
I would say probably not. No. Okay. Yeah. But in our organisation, the degree in which we would have those conversations with mothers coming to find their history would primarily be with local authorities. But if they did come to us, you know, the experience is very real for them as regards their understanding of consent, as you say.
Yes. Thank you. I was. This is Sir Peter Forrest. I was interested in your comment that unmarried mothers fall pregnant, because actually unmarried mothers didn't have an immaculate conception. There was another person involved, a man. I'm interested if any of the records of adoptions record the father or what led to the mother becoming pregnant, because we know that many young women are sexually abused, and I'm just interested to know whether any of the agencies, the mother and baby homes at the time, would have recorded that fact.
If the father's name was known and willingly given, then it did. And some of the babies were reunited as a family. Some people actually paid to come into our Salvation Army mother and baby homes themselves, because they saw it as a place of safety. And so, yes, we did. I'm trying to think back to what I actually said, in a sense, because the way you said that I said, I'm sorry if that was said. A lady falls pregnant, and I'm not talking about immaculate conceptions. I know.
On the question of whether you would have recorded if the baby was as a result of sexual abuse rather than willingly consenting.
I don't know. I'm just trying to think back to the records that I've seen, but certainly as much information as was willingly given would have been documented.
Okay. I just wondered whether any of the rest of the panel know about that particular aspect of women unmarried mothers. No. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. In its own inquiry, the JCHR found huge disparities in how quickly local authorities and agencies respond to requests for adoption records. So perhaps starting with Emily, I could ask you what specific changes you think would improve the speed and the consistency of responses to adoption record requests?
There has been research done by the Archives and Records Association, which has published guidance on how agencies could better respond to requests, but that doesn't have any teeth. And we do think that there should be sort of waiting time standards, there should be standards around redaction, because at the moment there are not really rules around when information can be redacted, and there should be better training for those responsible for helping people access their records, so it can be trauma informed. We've had examples of people being told really difficult information, such as their birth father having passed away, without the right, that being told in a very blunt sort of bureaucratic way, rather than considered very sensitively. And there should be better standards around the retention of information, so that it should be retained to 150 years, and with a view to improving the sort of digitisation of records, so that there can be permanent retention of people's records. So it must meet much better national standards.
Yeah. Emma, sorry.
Yeah, I echoing comments just made. I also think looking towards a sort of single point of access for people. I think what happens is it takes a lot for people to decide that they want to access their records, and then people are subsequently bounced around to different agencies. I think with a single point of access, the centralised system that would be for being the conduit with our regional adoption agencies and local authorities, doing the redaction work, doing the summary work, doing the emotional containing and holding, so people feel held by a service and not on the periphery dealing with unknowns. I think sometimes people can manage the knowns of delays. It's the not knowing that is really harmful. I think with a single point of access, it would still mean that local authorities and regional adoption agencies have visibility and accountability, because they would still need to sign off or agree any summaries that they do anyway. For example, when we're commissioned to do access to records, they still have that final oversight. But a single point of access would mean a team that is dedicated, trauma-informed, specialised in this work, and focused only on this work.
So you've preempted my next question, which is what is your view on proposals for a single point of access? But perhaps, Emily, we could go back to you. And what's the view of Adoption UK on that?
We would agree with that proposal, and that's something we've proposed in the barometer recommendations. We've had some input from adult adoptees on our advisory group who are concerned around making sure that any records that exist are fully, that there wouldn't be transfer of those records and the risk of losing or missing information. But that idea of a single point of access, which is supportive, trauma-informed, people agree with that proposal. But as long as Emma said, there's accountability for the agencies involved, so that isn't sort of removed, because obviously there were agencies involved in these processes, and that needs to be maintained.
And Brenda, if I could just ask you, if somebody comes to Barnardo's to ask for their adoption records, roughly how long would it take for them to get a response?
3 to 5 months.
3 to 5 months?
Yes. We've invested a lot of focus and resource into this, because we recognise the importance for us, both as a childcare archive department and the work around adoption. And we have a dedicated team who respond in understanding if the individual has been adopted through us, or as I said before, some birth families, but also working, and I think if we're moving towards the recommendation of a single point of access, one of the recommendations we would make is having a system that allows this agency or that point of contact to work across both local authorities, regional adoption agencies and voluntary adoption agencies, because that is key. Because for many, their records are just not held within one agency. They may have had a journey to that point. And I think it's important that that lens is applied. So for people who do come forward to see their records, they experience as one point of contact. And I think going back to the point of the standards is very key. That if we're moving forward, that we have those standards about redaction, about access, but primarily the support. We must have trained, experienced, adoption competent individuals and who are aware to work with individuals and support them through this journey. And not only just have that therapeutic lens, but build in that therapeutic support service as well, which is so important.
Do you think 5 months is an acceptable time for somebody to wait after making an initial inquiry, which might be something that they've spent years building up to do?
We make an immediate response within that time, and we gather some initial information. So within that time is we are then going back with initial information and engaging with the individual. So, they just don't wait 3 to 5 months with no contact. As soon as somebody makes a contact, we obviously respond immediately, and then we work with them to gather their present position and their request to us.
Thank you. And Mr. Forrest, how long would it take for the Salvation Army to respond to a request?
5 days. Initially 5 days, and then depending on the availability of ID, birth information, a further 5 days we would be able to give that information.
Thank you.
Can I just ask Emily and Emma whether you think that there is a need to legislate around records in this country, both in relation to the kind of preservation of records and the obligations on organisations that hold records, but also on redaction and those kinds of issues. And if there's obviously, we are seeking to get to recommendations for the government. There are obviously timescale implications for legislation. It can be a bit complicated. We would obviously want to make a recommendation if that was something that was needed and worthwhile. So just welcome your thoughts specifically on that.
I think that there are, as you say, advantages and disadvantages. So legislation would mean that people have more of a legal right to access their records and have those standards, and also particularly around the retention of records. I think legislation could be really beneficial. I think it doesn't necessarily have to wait for legislation. I think we could have, further statutory guidance in the meantime to make sure that, because there is a risk that information is lost in the meantime, and we really want urgent action here.
Mm-hmm. Similar, I think it's the issue around retention of records is really important. I think being able to, there is a call, isn't there, for those to be held for a much longer period, which I agree with, and I think if we were to look at how summaries are completed across the board, the thing that we see is the difference in reductions, and we know that the CALG researchers saying to us, we should be asking why aren't we leaving things in there? We should be leaving names of social workers in there. We shouldn't be redacting everything that's in there. If social workers were accountable for those plans at the time, they're still accountable. And I think having some guidance around redactions, in particular, and summaries is vital. But again, legislative approach may add delay to that.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And Jess.
Yes, there is well-documented evidence that mothers and adoptees affected by forced adoption practices can feel shame, self-blame and trauma. We heard that extensively in our first panel. What is your assessment of the current availability of trauma-informed mental health pathways for adult adoptees and birth mothers? And can I start with Emily?
Mm-hmm. And so it's a real priority issue for adoptees, and this comes out in the barometer. 72% reported they'd access professional services as an adult from a range of providers, but less than a third say they know where they can access counselling and therapeutic services that is adoptee competent. I think that's really important. You've heard from the other witnesses earlier today about the change that was made to the Ofsted registration, which was a barrier for people to seek access to support, because you would often go to a therapist and they would say, I'm sorry, I can't support you because you're adopted, because they weren't Ofsted registered. So that has been removed. But what's happened now is that there is a very little information available for people as to whether a therapist has the understanding of adoption, and that links to that sort of wider societal understanding of adoption as something which is a positive thing, and actually to have a therapist that really understands the impact that adoption has had on your life and is continuing to have is really important. So we are trying to work with organisations like the BACP, the KCP, to see what better guidance and competency frameworks can be available, and more information and advice for adoptees as to where they can access therapy. But we also do think this is something that should be looked at by the NHS, so that there should be better training for NHS professionals in adoption. There should be a possibility for adoptees to have a marker on their records that they are adopted, if they want to have that, and that there should be trauma-informed pathways through the NHS, so that people can access therapy, because there shouldn't be a cost involved to accessing therapy.
Thank you. Brenda?
Yes, I would concur with that as well, because that would be our experience. And I think over the years of understanding of the impact, if an adult adoptee comes forward and seeks support post their event in their lives, their situation, they need to be able to access sensitive and effective therapeutic support. In Barnardo's, we have started to train some counsellors to prepare and ensure that we can then offer an informed service to adult adoptees as they come forward, and that's an area we're trying to develop, in recognition that access to therapeutic support is quite challenging at the moment because of the pressures on the NHS in child social care per se. So having that degree of understanding and training for those therapists is critical.
Thank you. Emma?
Yes, what we see is people frequently struggling in normal NHS pathways, because professionals often overlook the trauma that is attached to adoption. The adult adoptee movement spoke very eloquently about this last time, that adoptees have spent years navigating NHS systems before reaching any kind of intervention that was is helpful, that the adoption-linked trauma is often overlooked, and adoptees are seen as blank slates as infants, sort of often leading to missed or delayed treatment, which again just creates more significant barriers, including misdiagnoses and a lack of trauma-focused therapy. And that emotional burden of repeatedly explaining adoption history to clinicians who are not adoption aware, it does have an impact. We have recently, within our organisation, delivered training to counsellors to offer them training in becoming adoption competent, to really understand the issues that are present in terms of loss, identity and relational trauma. So we're hopeful that can continue.
Thank you. Some of that kind of crosses over my next question, which is about what practical changes to post-adoption counselling services would help to ensure that mothers and adoptees can safely access the care they need. I'm quite interested in trauma-informed pathways because this is obviously something that is sort of building in terms of the evidence base for its effectiveness, but often sits outside of the NHS within the voluntary and the specialist sector who sort of work to make sure that that's accessible. To what extent can the NHS develop its own trauma-informed services? I'm quite interested just to understand that a bit. Or would this need to sit and stay within the sectors that work most frequently with adoptees?
I would say I don't think it should be an either or, but I think it will take time for there to be appropriate trauma-informed pathways, and particularly adoption-informed pathways within the NHS, because then there has to be recognition that adoption has caused, that there has been the fact that you are unable to grow up with your birth parents, that loss, that separation right from birth, even if it isn't after several care home moves, which is often the case now, foster care moves nowadays, but even right from birth, that has had an impact on someone, and there has to be that recognition for people to recognise the impact of adoption and that lifelong impact. So it will take time for training and to get those pathways right in the NHS. So there are things that could be done in the meantime. The government could conduct research into the availability of adoption-informed therapy. As I said, organisations like the PAC-UK are looking at competency frameworks so that it is easier for people to access adoptee competent therapy, but the cost is a huge issue. So if you're not able to get that therapy for free, and that's something that could be looked at as part of a response to an apology.
Thank you. And do any other panellists have any comments on what practical changes we could make to post-adoption counselling?
I think it's about accessibility and information. We've reflected this morning about the stigma of adoption and the lack of recognition and understanding, whether it's through the therapeutic channels. And I think it's about having good access pathways for people on their journey and easy access, because at the moment, I think as we've heard, it can be quite complex, complicated, disjointed.
Thank you. Darren.
Thank you. Based on your organisation's experiences, what factors most commonly influence whether reunions between adoptees and birth relatives are positive, difficult or unsuccessful?
I think I would talk about the need for the right intermediary support. Often people tell us about their experiences where they may have sought to trace family without the right support because they either weren't aware that the support existed or they didn't even realise that they might need support at first because they may have, I think one quote we had from the barometer was, "I was an innocent abroad. I had no idea of how difficult this was going to be for me to sort of trace birth family," and people then going for that without support, and then that meaning that those relationships weren't able to be sustained, and that sort of sense of regret. But sadly, we find that when people do access support, they're not always getting the right support available. So only around a quarter of adoptees responding to the barometer said that the support available for adoptees who wish to trace their birth family in adulthood, that they felt confident in that. And 22% are confident the support is available for birth parents, and it's really important that the support is there for both sides of the equation, because if you're only supporting adoptees, then they're not, the birth parents are not getting support, and that could mean the relationship still breaks down.
I think we're starting to see some of the learning being implemented in today's adoption situations, where we have a focus now on staying in touch. So where when an adoption takes place, there is the exploration of how the service and support agencies will allow that to happen. And I think that's informing, that's been informed by the experience when people have been seeking out family members, maybe through the internet, etc., and realising that having that infrastructure in place is so critical for the impact, as Emily's just said. We need to ensure that moving forward, that those individuals who are taking that step for the first time are aware of the services and support available to them, because to have that secondary loss or rejection is so hard and so difficult, and to help individuals to move beyond that. And I think there's an onus as providers and as people who work in adoption to be able to ensure that that full package of support is there for individuals when they go on that journey.
The Salvation Army doesn't actually target an adoption aspect to its work, but the family tracing service does have a number of people who have been adopted or have been affected by adoption as part of their clientele group. And it's about relationship, it's about building that relationship. Sometimes we've found just the opportunity to make contact would be sufficient, whilst others need that full reconciliation. And our pathway into that is fairly comprehensive and helpful.
I think a lot of it is about choice. I think having choice to access support if you would like it, and funding not being a barrier to that, and people making approaches without support can be difficult. And I think being able to support both parties is vital, really, so everyone can kind of process how they're feeling about what's going on. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is within our agency is we were awarded funding by Adoption England for an initial 18-month pilot to provide funded intermediary services, and within that period we've had 1,259 expressions of interest, which shows the level of people wanting support and wanting that choice of actually going down the route of having support, of having a supported intermediary. 60% of those applications were from adoptees, and 40% were from birth relatives. And those are the figures that we're seeing already, and I think that's without an apology. So I think for it to work, it's about choice, people having the option of having support if they want to.
Would any of you have any comments on how intermediary services can be supported to reduce the risk of distressing or harmful outcomes?
I think the funding is a key one. So I think at the moment there just isn't enough availability of services for people to get the right support, and so often I think long waits and also just more awareness of the support available. I would just echo what Emma was saying, that it should be a choice, and I think support shouldn't be a barrier for people to accessing information, because it is their right to have that information, but at the same time they should have the right support around that as well.
Thank you. I'm going to ask in a minute about your views on an apology and on redress. But before I do that, I just wanted to ask both Brenda Farrell and Peter Forrest to reflect on your contributions at the start of the session. So we have a number of people in the room today who have lived experience of this system and this process. And I could tell that when both of you led off with an initial narrative which said our organisation essentially wasn't too much of a part of the problem, because we were dealing with women who consented, but we were providing help for people who needed it, that was deeply painful for people who have lived experience to hear. What we now understand from academic research is that this period in our history was a systemic coercion of women in which many different parts of the state, the voluntary sector and religious sector, were culpable, which took place over many decades. And what we understand is that the consequences of that system for mothers was deeply traumatic, and that the consequences of that system for adoptees, who often were led to believe that they were not wanted or loved, was deeply traumatic. So before we get to the question of asking for your thoughts on the question of an apology and the government's role, I want to ask both of you whether you think there's a need for your organisations to reflect on the story that you tell about yourselves in the context of what we now understand about the history. Brenda, Farrell.
To clarify that was not the intent of the statement we were making, and I do want to acknowledge that we did not want to cause any upset to people who've been on their journey through adoption. As Barnardos, we have, through our records, fully understand the journey we have been on as an organisation, and we are very aware of the impact that we have had on individuals and children's and families' lives in the work that we have done, especially here today in adoption. And as you say, from the context of which we now understand and see the role that the organisation would have played. What I was conveying was that our understanding is we weren't in the delivery of mother and baby homes. That was a factual understanding of our history. But I do acknowledge that we were involved in adoptions in society at that time of which we're reflecting on. And we totally acknowledge the role and responsibility that we have as an organisation, both then and now, to individuals to which we have provided care or have been involved in a process during that time. And we acknowledge our responsibility within that totally. And it was not my intent or our intent to in any way cause a disrespect to those individuals and or to the role that we have played.
Thank you. Peter Forrest.
Totally echo what Brenda's just said. That was certainly not a comment that was made in order to offend at all, and I would happily withdraw that comment. I think I was trying to just suggest that we were a small part trying to do our bit in society to try and help those who were themselves needing a specialist care safe space. So it was out of that heart of love that we commenced our work, and that's been the pervading aspect to our life throughout the time that we're looking at. So I apologise absolutely for any offence that I may have caused in that process.
I mean, I would just say that what you've just said restates the narrative that is the problem here. And I think you and your organisation may want to reflect a little bit more about the story that you tell about yourself in the context of the objective and independent analysis of the history that we now understand, and the testimonies of women who and adult adoptees who experienced that system during the time. But I want to come now to the questions about acknowledgement, support and redress, and how understanding what we do about that period of our history, about the traumatic impact that it had on mothers and on adult adoptees, what can be done at this point to start to put things right at the level of institutions and of the government. And I'd welcome your thoughts on an apology, but also, as we heard from our first panel, the actions that would be needed to surround and support and be a part of an apology, to make that apology meaningful and helpful. And I'll start with you, Emily, if that's okay.
Yes, so Adoption UK are calling for an apology from the government. We think that it's really important that apology, as I've said previously, is not just to birth mothers, but also to the children who are now adults who have been affected by this period of adoption. But an apology on its own is not enough. There needs to be redress. We think that there should be, as I've said, much better support for access to records and standards around that, support for tracing of birth family, and access to therapeutic support, which is adoptee competent, and there needs to be action taken on all of those issues in order for an apology to be appropriate. And it needs to be, this is a quote from one of our adoptee advisory group, it needs to be framed in a way that triggers greater understanding that adoption is not a case closed, happy ever after situation, and bodies need to welcome, support and help us find our way through the question marks in our lives rather than hold us at arm's length. So I only ask for words if it prompts, for instance, a significant focus and upswing in support for the youngsters on the adoption journey, and that we as adults are all not left abandoned by a society that would still prefer to look the other way.
Thank you. Wonderful.
I think to concur that the information is very much that an apology is necessary. But Barnardo's view on apology is that it must be based on the individuals and their experience of what that apology should look like. And I think that listening to the feedback and the information today from the other nations about the extent to which that apology can be true to the adult adoptees and those who've been affected by adoption is so important. As an organisation in Barnardo's, we continue to learn from our own experience on this journey, as I've mentioned, and we would be willing to share our insight and information on the journey that we've had with individuals through our services. And obviously, as we've already reflected on, if we are moving forward, the recommendations that we've made about access to records and support, because mindful that if there is a public apology or redress around that, that will increase the demand and issues for members of the public. So I would want us to be assured that we work together to provide that support when members of the public do come forward. I think it was raised what happened in the Republic of Ireland. It's ensuring that we can provide individuals with that support that is trauma-informed, sensitive, and we have the resource and ability to do that. I think that's as important as making the apology in itself, that we are ready as an agency and with our colleagues to support individuals and adult adoptees through that.
Thank you.
We've been on this journey for a little while. In 2022, our Territorial Commander issued a full and unreserved apology to mothers and families who had had poor experiences within our mother and baby homes, and where it's been sought, have facilitated a face-to-face apology from one of our senior leaders directly with the individuals concerned. So an apology for ourselves we have done, and on our website invites people who feel that they have had a poor experience of life in that system that we offered at the time to come forward, and we have that practice in place. We would just want to ask the question for a blanket apology. What would you be apologising for, rather than just simply agree with it, yes, we must apologise. We need to apologise where there is poor experience and where we've fallen short. A blanket apology for this period of time would cover all aspects of midwifery given in teaching hospitals and the likes of those organisations. And we would just want to air caution as to, we need to be very specific for the apology to be seen as truth.
And I think that would perhaps speak to some of the comments we heard from our previous panel about the need for an apology to be co-created with those who had that direct experience. And again, I would just reflect that that there's a contrast between the reality of the apology that the Salvation Army made and the narrative that you began this evidence session with, which didn't mention that you'd made an apology or acknowledge any wrongdoing at all.
I only didn't mention it because I knew you would want to be asking that question later on, that's all.
Leave that there. Emma?
PAC-UK would welcome and are behind an apology from the government. The lifelong impact is, we've heard, is really significant. And while a formal apology is what many would like to hear and see, it's not enough in itself. And again, it comes back to the support that's available. One thing that I would say is that I don't feel that adoption work sits comfortably within children's services, and that's where a lot of the work kind of comes from. Children's services were never designed for lifelong adoption work, which is why it needs its own home. Because the sort of pace and professional mindset and legal frameworks are fundamentally different for children's services. You know, adults accessing their records need emotional support and space for reflection, and it's not crisis driven. So it feels that it needs the right home.
Thank you very much. I want to say a couple of things before we finish up. Firstly, thank you very much for coming today and giving us your evidence. It has been very helpful for the committee. I'll say the same thing to all of you that I said to our previous witnesses, which is to say if there was anything that you'd like to clarify or provide us with further information on, or that we didn't have time to discuss today, that you'd like to share with the committee, please do write to us following the evidence session. We would very, very much welcome that. And also to say, for anybody who has lived experience who's in the room, who's found today's evidence session challenging, we do have a space that you can go to. You're also welcome to stay in this room for a little bit longer after the evidence session, if that would be helpful. Thank you once again for being here this morning. That brings our session to a close for today. Order.